So today is July 4th, 2026, which, is a day pretty much entirely dedicated to this ultimate, unquestionable human good, freedom.
Right, yeah. The big one.
Exactly. But what if our modern obsession with liberty is just completely wrong? Like, what if freedom is actually this terrifying burden and we secretly at least kind of crave being stripped of it just to spare ourselves the agonizing weight of choice?
I mean, framing freedom as a psychological terror rather than a, universal, it completely flips the script on how we understand human motivation. And it's honestly the exact contradiction that makes today's deep dive so incredibly relevant.
It really is. So we're diving into a really diverse stack of sources today, exploring the philosophical architecture of Fyodor Dostoevsky.
Heavy hitter.
Totally. We've got a passionate literary essay from the North Coast Antiquarian, this really dense academic paper on existential philosophy, and a brilliant university thesis that somehow bridges 17th century theology with modern macroeconomics.
Which sounds crazy, but it works so well.
Right. It's amazing. Our mission today is to take these sources and discover why a 19th century Russian novelist holds the ultimate cheat code for understanding modern anxiety, political polarization, and the search for meaning. Okay, let's unpack this.
So, to crack the code on this material, we really have to look past the literature itself for a second. Dostoevsky was operating during a period of, intense social upheaval. He was surrounded by these emerging rationalist and utilitarian philosophies.
The idea that we could basically fix everything with math. Right?
Exactly. The popular theory of the day was that human misery could be eradicated with pure logic. But Dostoevsky argued that the tension between our desire for freedom and the suffering that freedom inevitably brings, it isn't some glitch in human nature.
Oh, right.
Yeah, he's saying it is the very engine of our humanity.
And we see that engine just misfiring immediately when we look at the individual mind in Notes from Underground. The academic paper on existentialism breaks this down perfectly. It highlights how the underground man is Dostoevsky's weapon against that utilitarian calculus of the 19th century.
Yes, utilitarianism basically argued that you could mathematically model human behavior, maximize pleasure, minimize pain.
Simple as that, right?
Right. If you just show a person the rational data of what's in their best interest, they will naturally act on it, and society will eventually achieve perfection.
But the underground man completely short-circuits that mathematical model. Like, he possesses immense self-awareness and understands exactly what would benefit him, yet he actively, intentionally sabotages his own life.
And the mechanism here is crucial. He chooses pain and humiliation, specifically to prove he is a human being with agency, not just some, piano key being pressed by the laws of physics.
Wow. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, his extreme introspection becomes an act of rebellion against a deterministic universe.
Which is wild. And the existentialism paper draws a fascinating parallel here with Jean-Paul Sartre, who later famously stated that humans are condemned to be free.
Right. For Sartre, the infinite choices of freedom create a crushing existential weight.
Yeah, but Dostoevsky's mechanism is slightly different. Dostoevsky argues that achieving true spiritual freedom requires the agonizing process of confronting your own deepest, ugliest flaws.
It's not pretty.
No, it's not. The underground man's tragedy isn't that he lacks self-awareness. It's that his self-awareness is utterly decoupled from action. Like, there is a line from the source material that hits like a physical blow. Quote, "I swear to you that to think too much is a disease."
Ouch. Yeah, that one hurts.
Seriously. And when you read that through a modern lens, the underground man becomes the exact prototype of the internet user trapped in an endless doom scroll of self-help optimization.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. You consume infinite deep dives and articles on how to optimize your sleep, your career, your diet. You possess all the rational data required to construct the optimal life.
But the cognitive load of that infinite hyper-awareness is so heavy that it just paralyzes you.
Exactly. You stay on the couch, optimizing your mindset in a vacuum, completely incapable of making a real-world decision.
And that paralysis is the direct result of treating the intellect as a sanctuary rather than a tool. When the mind refuses to interface with the friction of the real world, it cannibalizes itself. The intellect basically becomes a cage.
A cage, yeah. So the underground man proves that radical self-awareness leads to total paralysis. But Dostoevsky knew human nature doesn't stay paralyzed forever, right? Eventually, that trapped intellectual energy violently forces its way outward.
Which is exactly the psychological architecture he builds in Crime and Punishment.
Right. When someone decides to break out of that intellectual basement and impose their rational will onto the external world, you get Rodion Raskolnikov.
Yeah, the utilitarian calculus we discussed earlier reaches its terrifying logical extreme here. Raskolnikov constructs this framework dividing humanity into, basically, the ordinary masses and extraordinary individuals.
The Napoleon complex.
Exactly. He posits that extraordinary individuals have a mathematical duty to step over conventional moral laws if their actions serve a greater societal good.
And we all know the practical application of his theory. He brings an axe down on the pawnbroker.
Yep.
On paper, his utilitarian math is flawless. One parasitic life traded to fund the potential greatness of a genius. But the moment the physical act is committed, his entire rational architecture shatters. And I want to push back on this point for a second because reading the academic analysis, it begs the question.
Okay, what is it?
Well, is Dostoevsky arguing that ambition and logic are inherently corrupt? Or did Raskolnikov just have a weak stomach? Like, was it simply a failure of execution?
That's a great question. But the existential paper makes it really clear. This is not a biological failure of nerve. Dostoevsky is illustrating a mechanical failure of philosophy.
The mechanical failure.
Yeah. The ends cannot justify the means because the human conscience is not a variable you can just isolate and control in an equation. Raskolnikov's neurological and psychological reality completely rebels against his abstract theory.
Right, he becomes paranoid.
Paranoid, physically ill, deeply isolated. Because empathy and conscience are undeniable structural components of the human psyche. When you violate them, the system crashes.
The system crashes. And the system reboot only happens through Sonia.
Yes.
She operates as the total inverse of Raskolnikov's intellectual hubris. She has endured immense degradation, yet she retains this radical, steadfast compassion. She doesn't debate his theories, she simply reflects his humanity back to him.
Sonia proves that genuine greatness is not achieved through intellectual dominance or the imposition of will. It requires total accountability.
Accountability, yeah.
Raskolnikov's confession and his subsequent suffering in Siberia, they serve as a psychological crucible. The intense heat of that suffering brings away the artificial framework of its utilitarian calculus, leaving only the raw materials for genuine redemption.
So he learns the hard way that you cannot engineer utopia by utilizing other human beings as paving stones.
Precisely.
Which brings us to a massive collision. Raskolnikov accepts his suffering to find personal redemption. But what happens when suffering is inflicted on the completely innocent?
Yeah, this is where it gets heavy.
Really heavy. What happens when it's not a guilty murderer earning his redemption, but an innocent child enduring agony? This is the ultimate challenge explored in The Brothers Karamazov through Ivan Karamazov, and it's where our university thesis source dives really deep into 17th century theodicy.
Right. And for those who might not spend their weekends reading 17th century philosophy, theodicy is basically the attempt to reconcile a perfectly good, all-powerful God with the existence of evil.
Right.
The thesis contrasts two major 17th century frameworks. First, you have Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who argued that God created the best of all possible worlds.
And the mechanism of Leibniz's argument is that what we perceive as evil is merely a localized necessity for universal harmony. And the thesis uses this brilliant environmental analogy for Leibniz. If you engineer a general law of nature to distribute rainfall optimally across the entire planet, the mechanical reality of that system might mean one specific valley suffers a catastrophic drought.
It's brutal, but logical.
Right. The drought isn't an act of malice. It is simply the systemic cost of global atmospheric harmony.
But then you have the contrasting view, which belongs to Baruch Spinoza. He argued for a morally neutral, entirely deterministic universe. In Spinoza's framework, the universe operates out of pure mathematical necessity.
Cold, hard math.
Yeah, God does not possess human morals. The concepts of good and evil are just subjective human labels we slap onto events based on whether they help or hinder our personal survival. A hurricane isn't evil, it's just physics.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Ivan Karamazov looks at this debate, the idea of a divine harmony built on necessary suffering, or a mathematically neutral universe, and he utterly rejects both.
Yep, throws them both out.
Why does he refuse to accept a universe where suffering is just the cost of doing business, even if it all balances out in the ultimate utopia?
Because the calculus completely breaks down at the sight of a tortured child.
Huh.
Ivan presents his deeply faithful brother, Alyosha, with a thought experiment. He asks Alyosha to imagine constructing the ultimate edifice of human destiny, a perfect utopia where everyone is finally happy and peaceful.
Okay.
But the foundational bedrock of this utopia requires the unredeemed torture of just one tiny, innocent child. Ivan forces the question, Would you accept the role of architect on those terms?
And Alyosha answers, no, I would not.
Right. This is the core of Ivan's rebellion.
Hmm.
He argues that if the ultimate heavenly harmony requires the unredeemed tears of an innocent to balance the cosmic scales, the price of admission is bankrupt.
He respectfully returns his ticket.
Yes, exactly. He refuses to participate in a system that justifies horrific means for harmonious ends. But this rejection creates a terrifying vacuum. Well, because Ivan rejects a universe where human freedom allows for such evil, he is philosophically forced to conceptualize an artificial human alternative. A system where suffering is eradicated entirely, which necessarily means eradicating freedom along with it.
Oh, wow. Which brings us right to the parable of the Grand Inquisitor.
The big one.
Yeah. I think most people know the setup. Christ returns during the Spanish Inquisition, performs miracles, and is immediately arrested by the Grand Inquisitor. The Inquisitor visits Christ in his cell and delivers this scathing monologue, arguing that offering humanity moral freedom was an act of cruelty because freedom only breeds anxiety and chaos.
And the North Coast Antiquarian essay does something really fascinating here.
It really does.
It takes the Inquisitor's trinity of control, miracle, mystery, and authority, and uses it as a psychological diagnostic tool for modern populism across the entire political spectrum.
Okay, really quickly before we dive into that, I need to jump in. We are absolutely not taking a political side here, left or right. Our goal is simply to convey this essayist's fascinating psychological lens on how the human desire for certainty can drive people across the political spectrum to trade the heavy burden of freedom for absolute authority.
Perfectly said.
Yeah.
And the mechanism of that trade-off is deeply rooted in human psychology. Let's look at authority first. The essay cites rhetoric like, I am the only one who can save this nation.
Right.
That is the voice of the Inquisitor. It operates by removing the cognitive load of decision-making.
Right.
Navigating a complex, globalized world is exhausting. Surrendering to an absolute authority relieves the individual of the anxiety of choice.
Wow. And then the essay breaks down miracle. It frames massive political promises like a physical border wall or sweeping overnight economic overhauls, not as practical policies, but as literal spectacle.
Yeah, performances.
Right. They are modern miracles designed to bypass rational debate and silence doubt by providing the illusion of immediate visible safety.
But the most insidious tool, I think, is mystery. The essayist points to conspiracy movements like QAnon as a weaponized deployment of mystery.
This part blew my mind.
Right. The brain constantly seeks narrative pattern matching. When a movement offers secret, exclusive knowledge, it triggers a massive dopamine release. It flatters the follower with the illusion of profound insight. But mechanically, it binds them to a rigid, impenetrable worldview that effectively shields them from having to process the unbearable, nuanced complexity of actual reality.
So we are just outsourcing the heavy lifting of being human. And honestly, this diagnostic tool applies far beyond politics. Look at modern predictive algorithms.
Oh, absolutely.
We gladly allow machines to dictate what media we consume, what products we purchase, and what information we read. Why? Because the endless freedom of choice in the digital age is paralyzing.
The algorithm basically functions as a highly efficient, personalized digital Grand Inquisitor.
Right. It analyzes your data and whispers, you no longer have to choose. I will shoulder the burden of choice for you, and I will feed you exactly what you desire.
And the Inquisitor, whether it's a political demagogue or a digital algorithm, understands that humanity fundamentally desires a world made safe through submission. It is a closed system where no one has to agonize over moral decisions because the state, the strongman, or the code has already processed the variables and made the decision for them.
But the result is a dystopian nightmare where human beings are reduced to livestock.
Yeah.
So we are caught in this impossible trap. The Inquisitor's absolute control is a nightmare. The underground man's radical freedom leads to paralyzing apathy. Raskolnikov's intellectual freedom leads to murder. If freedom brings unbearable suffering, but the alternative is chains, what is Dostoevsky's actual mechanism for survival?
The mechanism is actually revealed in Christ's response to the Inquisitor. For the entire monologue, Christ remains completely silent. At the very end, he simply approaches the old man and kisses him.
A kiss. I mean, it defies all logic. There is no counter-argument, no philosophical trap.
None. It is the ultimate manifestation of radical compassion. A kiss respects the agency and freedom of the other person without attempting to dominate or optimize them. Dostoevsky embeds this philosophy throughout his work. In The Idiot, Prince Mishkin operates with such absolute unprotected sincerity and vulnerability that a cynical society literally labels him an idiot.
Wow.
And in the Brothers Karamazov, Elders Zosima and Alyosha articulate the core doctrine. Everyone is guilty for everyone else.
Okay, now I have to stop here because this is where the thesis on economics blew my mind, but I also really need to push back.
Go for it.
On a purely psychological level, walking around repeating everyone is guilty for everyone else sounds like a recipe for a massive, lifelong anxiety attack. We're already bombarded with global tragedies on our screens 24/7. How is carrying the collective guilt of the entire planet supposed to liberate us?
I get that. But this is where the university thesis perfectly synthesizes Dostoevsky's theology with modern macroeconomics. If we reject the Grand Inquisitor, meaning we reject massive authoritarian macro control over every aspect of our lives, and we reject the underground man's apathetic paralysis, we need a third way.
Right.
The thesis defines this third way as micro-level voluntary suffering.
Micro-level voluntary suffering, and the thesis applies this to global supply chains and environmental impact. If you rely on unchecked, purely rational market forces, you inevitably get exploitation, sweatshops and pollution. But if you demand a governing body micromanage every single transaction globally to prevent any harm, you surrender all freedom to an inquisitor.
Exactly. So the Dostoevskian solution is personal moral responsibility injected into the economic machine. The thesis points to the fair trade movement and ethical consumption. When you stand in a store and recognize that a ridiculously cheap t-shirt exists because a laborer across the globe is being exploited, you face a choice.
You don't throw your hands up and say, this system is too complex, I'm just one person. That is the underground man.
Right. You accept your microfraction of that global guilt. By choosing to pay a premium for an ethically sourced product, you are voluntarily taking on a small measure of financial suffering. You are absorbing a piece of the supply chain's guilt. You aren't being forced by a government mandate, and you aren't hiding in cynical apathy.
You prove your spiritual freedom by voluntarily bearing the burden of responsibility.
Yes.
It creates a really vivid contrast. The Inquisitor wants macro-level control to erase suffering. Dostoevsky demands micro-level voluntary suffering to build genuine harmony.
And this is Alyosha's definitive answer to Ivan's rebellion. You cannot mathematically justify the tears of a child by pointing to a theoretical future utopia. The only way to redeem the suffering of the world is to actively share in it. True freedom isn't the chaotic ability to do whatever you want that just leads back to Raskolnikov's axe.
Right.
True freedom is the conscious daily choice to bear the heavy burden of radical empathy in a fundamentally broken world.
That is just incredible. The ground we've covered today maps the entire spectrum of the human condition. We started in the paralyzing, overthinking isolation of the underground man. We examined the catastrophic failure of Raskolnikov's intellectual hubris, where utilitarian logic shattered against human conscience. We navigated Ivan Karamazov's rejection of divine harmony and stared down the authoritarian temptation of the Grand Inquisitor, who offers us certainty in exchange for our agency.
That's a heavy journey.
It really is. And finally, we found a rigorous, practical path forward through radical empathy, vulnerable sincerity, and the voluntary acceptance of shared responsibility. When you synthesize these sources, a really profound realization emerges. Your internal friction, your moral agonizing, your struggle to navigate an overwhelmingly complex world, these are not bugs in your programming.
No, not at all.
They are not inefficiencies that need to be optimized away by the latest app or political ideology. That friction is the very proof of your freedom. It is the raw, unpolished material required to construct a deeply meaningful human life. So what does this all mean? How do we carry this 19th century diagnostic tool into tomorrow?
Well, if we project Dostoevsky's architectural map of the soul into our immediate technological future, we are left with a vital thought experiment.
I'm listening.
We must ask ourselves, could artificial intelligence become the ultimate, most insidious iteration of the Grand Inquisitor?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I am not talking about a malicious sci-fi scenario.
Right.
I'm talking about a highly efficient, incredibly benevolent system that perfectly executes miracle, mystery, and authority. A generalized AI arrives and promises to perfectly optimize our macroeconomy, solve our climate crises, and organize our daily schedules with zero friction, all in exchange for us quietly surrendering our cognitive and moral agency. Will we recognize the trap? Or will we, exactly as Dostoevsky predicted, eagerly hand over our liberty just to finally be free from the agonizing burden of choice?
Man, it certainly makes you look at those July 4th fireworks with a totally different lens. The real fight for freedom might not be a defense against a tyrant outside our borders, but a constant vigilance against our own deep neurological desire to be told exactly what to do. Keep thinking, keep wrestling with the friction, and whatever you do, don't let the algorithm make all your choices today. Catch you next time.